Freedom feels strange the first time you taste it after someone else has been deciding when you breathe. The quiet guest house settled around us as the clock on the wall ticked past midnight, each second sounding louder than it should in a place this still, and for the first time since I had opened the basement door at Victor's house, I realized how thin the silence actually was. Emily Carter stood near the small living room window, her arms loosely folded as she looked out into the dark line of oak trees surrounding the property, and the way she watched the shadows move told me she was still listening for footsteps that were no longer there. 3 days of waiting does not disappear just because a door opens. The wind moved softly through the branches outside, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and distant highway air, and I could almost see her mind measuring every sound the way someone does when the world has not felt safe for a while. I stayed where I was near the doorframe, giving her space because people who have been confined need room before they trust the walls around them. She finally turned slightly, studying the room again as though she was memorizing the shape of her surroundings, the small couch beside the lamp, the narrow kitchen counter, the wooden table near the window that looked like it belonged in an ordinary apartment rather than a safe house hidden at the end of a private road. "You really keep this place off the records," she said quietly. Her voice carried less fear now, more curiosity, like someone slowly stepping back into a life that had been paused for too long. I nodded once. Places like this exist for moments when the world becomes complicated. Emily considered that answer carefully, her gaze drifting toward the dark road outside again before she spoke. "Your brother is not the kind of man who forgets unfinished business." The statement was calm but certain. She had only met Victor Romano once, yet she already understood something most people in the city spent years learning. I folded my arms lightly and leaned against the wall. "No, he does not forget." The house creaked softly as the temperature shifted, a quiet settling sound that made Emily glance toward the hallway for a second before she realized it was nothing. "Then he will come looking," she said. I watched the reflection of the room in the glass behind her, thinking about the way Victor had stood in that basement watching us leave like a man who had already started planning the next move. "Eventually," I replied. Emily slipped her hands into the pockets of her jacket, feeling the shape of the small flash drive she had shown me earlier, and the gesture carried a quiet kind of determination that had not been there when I first saw her sitting beside that chain. "He believes I am a risk," she said softly, "and men like him remove risks." I walked a few steps farther into the room, stopping near the table where the lamp cast a warm circle of light across the wood. "Then he will have to reconsider the situation," I said. She studied my face carefully as though deciding whether confidence like that came from arrogance or experience. Outside, the trees moved again in the wind, and somewhere in the distance a car passed along the highway, its headlights briefly tracing the edge of the road beyond the property before disappearing into the night. Emily let out a slow breath and turned back toward the window, watching the darkness for another long moment. "Tonight you broke your brother's plan," she said quietly. I followed her gaze toward the empty road beyond the trees and listened to the quiet house around us. "No," I answered after a moment. Tonight he discovered it was never his plan alone. The quiet house held its breath after my words settled into the room, and for a moment the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway measuring seconds that felt heavier than normal time. Emily Carter remained near the window with her eyes on the dark trees beyond the glass, as if the night itself might shift and reveal someone watching from the shadows. Freedom had given her space to breathe, but not yet the comfort of certainty. I walked toward the small kitchen counter and filled a glass with water from the sink, the faint rush of the faucet breaking the silence that had settled between us since leaving the road behind. When I set the glass on the wooden table, she turned slowly and studied it for a second before crossing the room to sit down. The chair creaked softly under her weight, and she wrapped both hands around the glass as though the cool surface helped anchor her back into the present moment. 3 days in a basement changes the way ordinary things feel. Water tastes sharper, air feels wider, even light looks different. She took a small sip before speaking again. "You said this place exists for complicated moments," she said quietly. "How many of those moments have you had?" I leaned against the counter and considered the question. The lamp beside her cast a soft circle of yellow light across the table that reflected faintly in the glass she held. "Enough to know when one has not finished yet," I answered. Emily absorbed that without reacting right away. Her eyes drifted toward the hallway again, and then back to me, as if she were measuring the distance between safety and reality. Your brother does not seem like someone who waits very long before fixing a problem, she said. I allowed a small breath to escape. Victor prefers solutions that remain quiet, I replied. She nodded slowly and placed the glass back on the table with careful hands. Then the flash drive changes things, she said. I stepped closer and rested one hand on the back of the empty chair across from her. The small black device was still hidden in the pocket of her jacket, but it carried more weight than anything else inside the house tonight. Yes, I said. It does. Emily reached into her pocket and placed the flash drive on the table between us again. Under the warm light, it looked harmless. Small. Ordinary. The kind of thing someone might use to store family photos or college essays. But the way she looked at it made it clear she understood what it truly represented. Those files were on a laptop inside the office near the loading bay, she explained quietly. The accounting firm I work for handles paperwork for several shipping companies, and I thought I was in the right building. The door had the same street number. I listened without interrupting while she traced the edge of the device with her finger. The men inside were arguing about shipments arriving at the docks and about missing money. I was not supposed to hear any of it. When they noticed me, I pretended I was lost and left as quickly as I could. She paused for a second before continuing. But I copied the files first. I studied her expression carefully. The woman who had been sitting beside a chain hours earlier had already been thinking several steps ahead long before Victor decided she was a problem. You planned that quickly, I said. Emily gave a small tired smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Fear makes people think faster. The clock ticked again on the wall behind her, and the quiet house held the moment gently, as if it understood the fragile balance forming inside the room. I picked up the flash drive and turned it once under the light before placing it back down between us. Victor will assume the files exist, I said, even if he does not know where. Emily looked up at me, and the determination in her expression was clearer now than it had been all evening. Then he will keep searching, she replied. I nodded slowly. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees again, and the branches brushed together like quiet whispers in the dark. Yes, I said calmly. But this time he will not be the only one preparing for what comes next. The clock on the wall moved past 1 in the morning, while the quiet guest house held the same fragile calm that settles after a storm passes, but before anyone is certain the clouds are truly gone. Emily Carter remained seated at the wooden table with the flash drive resting between us under the warm light of the small lamp, and the longer she looked at it, the more I could see her mind replaying every moment that had brought her here. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the night wind, and the narrow road beyond them remained empty. But quiet places often hide the most complicated questions. I pulled out the chair across from her and finally sat down, the old wood creaking softly beneath my weight. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, and Emily glanced toward the front door before reminding herself that nothing was actually wrong. Habits formed in fear take time to fade. She folded her hands together on the table and studied my face with the careful attention of someone who had decided to trust a stranger but was still learning what that decision meant. You said earlier that there are rules in your world, she said slowly. The rule your brother ignored. I nodded once. The words had been simple when I spoke them in the basement, but here in the quiet light of the guest house, they carried more weight than they had before. There are lines that keep chaos from spreading, I said. If those lines disappear, then everything becomes unpredictable. Emily glanced toward the flash drive again before meeting my eyes. And now I am standing directly on one of those lines. The honesty in her voice made me pause for a second before answering. Yes, I said calmly. She leaned back slightly in the chair and let out a slow breath that sounded almost thoughtful rather than frightened. That explains why Victor did not simply let me leave. The name hung in the air between us, and for a moment the quiet house seemed to listen with us. Victor believes control solves uncertainty, I said. If he cannot control a situation, he tries to remove it. Emily absorbed that explanation and then reached forward to turn the flash drive slowly between her fingers as though it were a compass needle pointing towards something neither of us could fully see yet. Then he will assume I still have this, she said, even if he does not know where I am. I leaned forward slightly and rested my forearms on the table. Victor knows you saw something important, I replied. He will not stop until he believes the problem is finished. The small kitchen clock ticked again behind us while the wind brushed softly against the outside walls. Emily remained quiet for several seconds before speaking again. When he brought me to the basement, he asked only one question, she said. I waited. She lifted her eyes slowly. He asked whether anyone else had seen the files. The answer seemed obvious now, but the way she repeated the memory told me that moment had stayed with her. And what did you tell him? I asked. Emily gave a small, tired smile that carried more courage than she probably realized. I told him the truth, she said. I said no. I nodded slowly. That was the correct answer. She tilted her head slightly. But it will not matter forever. The certainty in her voice was calm now rather than afraid, and that difference mattered more than she. Understood. No, I agreed. It will not. Emily looked around the quiet room again as though measuring how much time the night might give us before the outside world caught up with us. The lamp hummed faintly beside the couch, and the refrigerator in the small kitchen let out a soft mechanical click as it shifted into another cycle. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. The kind of noises people rarely notice until silence becomes something dangerous. Finally, she looked back at me and asked the question that had clearly been forming in her mind since the car ride. What happens when your brother realizes you chose my side? I sat back in the chair and considered the dark road beyond the trees before answering. Victor will not see it that way, I said quietly. Emily frowned slightly. Then how will he see it? I allowed a faint breath to escape as the truth settled clearly into place between us. He will see it as a challenge. The quiet house absorbed the words while the clock continued measuring the seconds, and somewhere across the city my brother was almost certainly beginning to ask the same question we were now facing. What happens next? The word challenge lingered quietly in the small guest house long after I said it, as if the walls themselves understood the weight behind it. Emily Carter sat across from me at the wooden table with the flash drive still resting between us, and for the first time since we left the basement her expression was no longer shaped only by fear. Now there was something else there as well. Awareness. The quiet understanding that the situation surrounding her had grown larger than a simple mistake at the wrong address. Outside, the wind moved through the tall oak trees again, brushing their branches together in a slow whisper that drifted against the windows like distant conversation. Emily looked toward the sound for a moment before returning her attention to me. If your brother sees this as a challenge, she said slowly, then that means he believes you are standing in his way. I nodded once. The statement was not dramatic. It was simply accurate. Victor has never enjoyed obstacles, I replied calmly. Emily studied my face carefully as if trying to understand the relationship between the two brothers she had now encountered on the same night. But you said, the rules in your world exist for a reason, she continued. Would the people around him agree with that rule? I leaned back slightly in the chair and folded my hands together on the table. The question was a fair one. Most of them would, I said after a moment. The rule protects stability. Innocent people are not supposed to become part of our business. Emily gave a faint, thoughtful nod, but her eyes drifted again toward the flash drive resting on the table between us. And now I am both, she said quietly. A witness and an innocent person. The way she said it made the truth of the situation feel heavier inside the quiet room. I reached forward and gently slid the flash drive toward my side of the table, not to take it from her, but to remove it from the center of the space where it seemed to draw all attention. Right now you are a responsibility, I said. Emily looked up. Yours, she asked. I held her gaze without hesitation. Yes. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as the moment passed between us, and the sound felt strangely reassuring in the still house. Emily seemed to consider that answer carefully before leaning back slightly in her chair. You did not have to make that decision tonight, she said. I allowed a small breath to escape as the memory of the basement returned briefly to the front of my mind. The chain against the concrete floor. Victor standing at the bottom of the stairs watching us leave. Some decisions are made long before the moment arrives, I replied quietly. Emily tilted her head slightly. You mean the rule? I nodded. The rule exists because someone has to remember that power without limits eventually destroys the people who use it. The lamp beside the couch hummed faintly while the wind outside shifted direction again. Emily folded her arms loosely and glanced toward the dark window before asking the question that had clearly been waiting beneath the others. Do you think your brother understands that? I remained silent for a moment before answering. Victor understands many things, I said slowly. But sometimes he confuses control with strength. Emily absorbed that explanation and then looked back toward the flash drive again, as though it represented the point where those two ideas were about to collide. And this, she said softly, is what changes the balance. I followed her gaze. Yes. The room fell quiet again after that, and for several seconds neither of us spoke, while the clock continued its steady rhythm on the wall. Finally, Emily pushed her chair back slightly and stood up, walking a few steps toward the window where she could see the faint outline of the road beyond the trees. It is strange, she said after a moment. A few hours ago, I believed the worst thing that could happen was being locked in that basement forever. She turned to look at me again. Now I realized the story did not actually begin there. I rose slowly from the chair and joined her near the window. The night outside remained calm, and the empty road stretched quietly into the darkness. No, I said calmly. It began the moment you saw something my brother never intended anyone to see. Emily looked back toward the table where the flash drive rested under the warm light. Then that moment changed both of our lives. I followed her gaze toward the small black device and listened to the quiet house around us. Somewhere far across the city, my brother was almost certainly beginning to search for answers. Yes, I said quietly. And Victor is not the only one who knows that now. The night had grown deeper around the small guest house, and the wind outside moved more slowly now, as if the trees themselves had settled into the quiet rhythm of the late hour. Emily Carter remained standing beside the window with her eyes fixed on the narrow road that disappeared between the tall oaks at the edge of the property. From where we stood, the world looked calm, almost ordinary, but both of us understood that calm was temporary. Situations like this rarely stayed quiet for long. I stepped back toward the table and picked up the flash drive again, turning it slowly between my fingers while the lamp above cast a faint reflection across its smooth black surface. Such a small object to carry the weight of so many decisions. Emily watched the movement without speaking for a moment before she finally asked the question that had been forming since we arrived. What exactly will you do with it? Her voice was steady now, but there was still a trace of caution behind it. The kind that comes from realizing your future might depend on someone else's choices. I placed the device carefully on the table again and rested my hand beside it. First, I need to understand what is inside, I said. Victor mentioned shipments and ledgers. That suggests the files connect more people than just him. Emily walked slowly back from the window and stopped across from me, her arms loosely folded as she looked down at the flash drive again. When I copied the files, I did not have time to read everything, she admitted. I only knew that if something happened to me, there needed to be proof somewhere. The quiet determination in her words carried more confidence than it had earlier that night. Fear had given way to strategy. I nodded slightly. You were thinking ahead. Emily gave a small, tired smile. After a few hours in that basement, I realized waiting for someone else to decide my future was not a very good plan. The honesty in that sentence hung between us while the clock on the wall continued its steady ticking. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the roof, and the branches of the trees shifted again with a gentle rustle that reminded us how isolated the guest house truly was. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily asked another question, one that was quieter but far more important. If the files connect more people, will they all see me the same way your brother does? I considered that carefully before answering. Some of them might, I said, but others will be far more concerned about what the files reveal. Emily absorbed that explanation and slowly pulled out the chair beside the table before sitting down again. The movement seemed deliberate, as though she had decided the conversation was no longer about escape, but about understanding the situation clearly. So the flash drive is not just protection for me, she said slowly. It is leverage. I met her eyes across the table. Exactly. The words settled firmly in the quiet room. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment before letting out a slow breath. I never imagined my normal workday would end with something like that. I allowed a faint smile. Most people do not expect their lives to intersect with complicated situations. Emily glanced up again. Is that what you call this? I rested my hands lightly on the table. It is the most polite description available. The faintest hint of amusement crossed her expression before fading again into thought. She looked toward the front door briefly, and then back at me. Your brother will realize soon that I am gone, she said. I nodded. He probably already has. Emily tilted her head slightly. Then he will begin searching for me. Yes. The certainty of that answer did not need further explanation. The room grew quiet again while the night air shifted outside the windows. Emily leaned back in her chair and looked at the flash drive once more, as if recognizing that the small object had quietly changed the balance of power in ways she had never intended. Finally she spoke again, her voice calm but thoughtful. Then the next move belongs to whoever understands the situation first. I looked toward the dark road beyond the trees, and then back at the table where the flash drive rested under the lamp. That is correct, I said quietly. Which means we should not waste the advantage you created tonight. The advantage you created tonight remained resting quietly on the table between us, and for several seconds neither of us moved as the weight of that truth settled deeper into the room. The guest house was still wrapped in the calm silence of the late night, and the soft ticking of the wall clock seemed almost louder now that both of us understood the situation had shifted from survival to strategy. Emily Carter remained seated with her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table while her eyes studied the flash drive again as if she were seeing it differently now. It was no longer just insurance against fear. It was a piece of leverage in a situation that had suddenly grown larger than either of us expected. I reached across the table and picked up the small device once more, feeling the smooth plastic surface between my fingers while the lamp above cast a narrow shadow across the wood. Such a simple object to carry so many consequences. Emily watched me carefully before asking the next question that had clearly been forming in her mind since we started talking about the files. How do we see what is inside? Her voice carried a quiet determination that had not been there earlier. In the evening, the fear from the basement had slowly been replaced by focus. I nodded toward the small desk in the corner of the room where a closed laptop rested beside a stack of documents and a single reading lamp. That is the next step, I said. Emily followed my gaze across the room and then stood slowly from her chair. The movement seemed deliberate, as if she had already decided she wanted answers more than she wanted to remain comfortable in uncertainty. She walked beside me toward the desk, while the wooden floorboards creaked faintly beneath our steps. Outside the wind shifted again, and the branches of the oak trees brushed softly against one another like distant whispers moving through the night. When we reached the desk, I opened the laptop, and the screen lit the small space with a pale glow that reflected in the quiet room. Emily stood beside me with her arms loosely folded while I inserted the flash drive into the port on the side of the computer. For a moment, nothing happened, and then a small folder appeared on the screen. Emily leaned slightly closer, her expression focused in the light from the monitor. I opened the folder slowly, and rows of file names appeared in neat columns. Shipping schedules, transaction ledgers, storage manifests. Emily inhaled quietly beside me. Those are the names I saw, she said softly. I clicked on one of the documents, and a spreadsheet filled the screen. Columns of numbers and company names stretched down the page along with dates that matched several shipments scheduled at the South Docks over the past 6 months. Emily studied the screen carefully. Those trucks were arriving late at night, she said. The men inside the warehouse were arguing about delays and missing payments. I scrolled further through the files while the quiet hum of the laptop filled the room. Another document opened showing a list of business accounts connected to multiple shell companies spread across several states. The pattern was immediately clear. Victor had not been running a small independent operation. He had been coordinating something much larger. Emily seemed to reach the same conclusion at the same time. There are too many names, she whispered. I nodded slowly while the screen reflected across the desk. Which means Victor is not the only person involved. Emily stepped back slightly and folded her arms again while her eyes moved from the screen to the dark window across the room. If these people realize someone outside their circle has this information, she said quietly, they will not be happy. The understatement hung gently in the air. I removed the flash drive from the laptop and closed the screen halfway before turning toward her again. That is why we needed to see it first, I said. Emily looked back toward the desk where the computer now sat dark again, and the realization slowly settled into her expression. This is bigger than your brother, she said. I nodded once. Outside, the trees continued to move softly in the night wind while the empty road remained hidden in darkness beyond them. Somewhere across the city, Victor Romano was likely already trying to understand where the night had gone wrong. I placed the flash drive back on the desk and looked toward the quiet window again. Yes, I said calmly. And now the real problem is deciding who will realize it first. The quiet guest house seemed smaller after we saw the files inside the flash drive, and the calm that had filled the room earlier now carried a different feeling beneath it. Something sharper, something that made every sound more noticeable. The laptop screen had gone dark again, but the information we had seen remained clear in my mind like a map that could not be forgotten. Emily Carter stood near the desk with her arms folded loosely while she looked toward the window again, her expression thoughtful rather than frightened now. The realization that the situation involved far more people than Victor had changed something inside her. Fear alone does not prepare someone for complicated decisions. Awareness does. I walked back toward the center of the room and rested one hand on the back of the chair beside the wooden table where we had been sitting earlier. The flash drive remained on the desk behind us, and even though it was small, the presence of it felt larger than the room itself. Emily turned slowly from the window and studied my face for a moment before speaking. Those documents were not just shipping schedules, she said quietly. They were payments, transfers, different companies connected to the same shipments. I nodded once. Yes. She walked a few steps toward the table again and rested her hands lightly on the edge of it, which means the warehouse was only one piece of the operation. I pulled out the chair and sat down again while considering the pattern we had seen on the screen. Exactly. Emily leaned slightly forward, and the lamp beside the couch cast a faint glow across her face. Then Victor is not running this alone. I looked toward the dark laptop across the room before answering. No, the quiet confirmation settled between us like a weight neither of us had fully expected when we left the basement earlier that night. Emily slowly lowered herself into the chair across from me and looked down at her hands while the clock on the wall ticked steadily behind us. I thought I had simply walked into the wrong building, she said softly. Now it feels like I walked into the center of something much larger. The honesty in her voice carried no panic, only the calm recognition of reality. I folded my hands loosely on the table. You did. Emily lifted her eyes again and studied me carefully. And your brother is part of it. I held her gaze without hesitation. Yes. The room remained quiet for a few seconds while the wind outside brushed gently against the walls of the house. Then Emily asked the question that had clearly been forming since we reviewed the files. If the people connected to those records discover that someone outside their group has access to them, what will they do? I considered the answer carefully before speaking. They will try to regain control of the situation. Emily nodded slowly as if she had already expected that response. Which means Victor will not be the only one searching for answers. Correct. She leaned back in the chair and looked toward the ceiling for a moment, as though mentally arranging the pieces of a puzzle that had suddenly become far more complicated. Then the flash drive does not only make me important, she said quietly. It makes me dangerous. I allowed a faint breath to escape. It makes you valuable to the wrong people. Emily absorbed that sentence carefully before looking back toward the desk where the laptop sat dark again. And if they cannot control me, she continued slowly, they will try to control the information. I nodded once. Yes. The clock ticked again on the wall while the quiet house seemed to settle deeper into the night. Emily sat still for several seconds before speaking again. That means we have something they do not expect. I looked at her. What is that? She gestured lightly toward the flash drive resting beside the laptop across the room. Time, she said calmly. Because right now they believe the situation is still under control. I followed her gaze toward the desk where the small black device sat beneath the faint glow of the reading lamp. Outside, the trees moved gently in the night wind, and the narrow road beyond them remained empty and silent. Emily slowly turned back toward me again. But eventually they will realize something has changed. I nodded once while listening to the steady ticking of the clock and the quiet breath of the house around us. Somewhere across the city, my brother was likely already beginning to understand that the situation had moved beyond his control. Yes, I said quietly. And when they do, the next move will come very quickly. The quiet house seemed to hold its breath after Emily spoke about time being the one advantage we still had, and for several seconds neither of us moved, while the meaning of that settled more deeply into the room. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, measuring seconds that suddenly felt far more valuable than they had earlier in the night. Emily Carter remained seated across from me with her posture calm but alert, the kind of stillness that comes from someone who has begun to understand the rules of a situation that once felt impossible to navigate. Outside, the wind brushed softly through the oak trees, and the branches swayed slowly under the faint glow of the moon, casting moving shadows across the quiet road beyond the property. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked toward the desk where the laptop sat closed beside the flash drive. The files we had just reviewed had changed the balance of everything, not just between Emily and Victor, but between Victor and the people whose names appeared in those records. Emily followed my gaze, and after a moment she spoke again. If they believe the situation is still under control, that means Victor has not told them what happened tonight. I nodded slowly. Not yet. Emily tilted her head slightly, as if measuring the logic behind that answer. Why would he wait? I folded my hands loosely together on the table. Because admitting a mistake too quickly creates more problems than it solves. Emily considered that carefully. So he will try to fix it first. Exactly. The quiet explanation hung between us while the clock ticked steadily behind my shoulder. Emily leaned forward slightly and rested her elbows on the table. Which means he will begin looking for me before anyone else knows something is wrong. I nodded once. Victor prefers to handle complications personally. Emily looked toward the dark window again, and the reflection of the room shimmered faintly across the glass. Then he will start with the places he thinks he would take someone. I allowed a small breath to escape. Yes. She turned back toward me. And this place. I followed her glance around the quiet guest house. The small living room. The narrow kitchen. The simple furniture that made the building look like nothing more than a weekend rental hidden among trees. This place does not exist in the records connected to my name, I said calmly. But Victor knows me well enough to consider it. Emily absorbed that without reacting immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the flash drive again, as if the small object contained the answer to the next decision we needed to make. Then staying here too long would be risky, she said quietly. I nodded slowly. Yes. The room fell silent again, while the wind outside brushed gently against the roof of the house. Emily leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders loosening slightly, as if she had accepted the direction the situation was taking. It is strange, she said after a moment. Earlier tonight, I was hoping someone would open a door and let me leave that basement. I listened while she continued. Now we are discussing where I should disappear next. I allowed a faint smile. Situations change quickly. Emily returned the small smile, but her expression remained thoughtful. You keep saying disappear, she said. But the files mean that eventually someone will need to know the truth. I glanced toward the desk again, where the laptop sat quietly beside the flash drive. Yes, I said. But timing matters. Emily nodded slowly as if that answer made sense. Then the question becomes when the truth is more valuable than silence. The clock ticked again, while the quiet guest house seemed to settle deeper into the late hour. I stood slowly from the chair and walked toward the window beside the couch, where the dark road disappeared between the trees. Emily turned slightly in her chair to watch me. Outside the night remained calm, but experience had taught me that calm rarely lasted long when powerful people believed control had slipped away from them. I folded my arms loosely and studied the empty road for several seconds before speaking again. Victor will begin asking questions soon, I said quietly. Emily followed my gaze toward the darkness outside. And when he realizes he cannot control the answer, she said, finishing the thought carefully. I nodded once. The wind moved through the trees again, and the branches swayed gently against the night sky. Then he will come looking for me. The night outside the guest house remained quiet, but the stillness no longer felt peaceful. It felt temporary. I stood near the window watching the narrow road disappear between the trees while the wind moved slowly through the branches, and Emily Carter remained seated behind me at the table, her attention fixed on the dark glass, as if she could already imagine the moment someone might appear there. The clock on the wall ticked past another minute, and the quiet sound seemed sharper now that both of us understood the situation was moving towards something inevitable. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm but thoughtful. If he comes looking for you, then that means he already knows where to start. I nodded once without turning from the window. Victor always starts with the places that matter most. Emily remained silent for a moment before the soft creak of the chair told me she had stood up. I heard her footsteps cross the wooden floor, and then she stopped beside me near the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The guest house light behind us cast a warm glow across the room, but outside the trees remained dark and still. "Do you think he will come tonight?" she asked quietly. I considered the question while studying the empty road. Victor was patient when patience helped him, but he was also stubborn when something challenged his control. "Not tonight," I said finally. "Right now he will be confirming what he already suspects." Emily folded her arms loosely as she looked out into the darkness beside me. "That I am gone." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "And that you helped me." I allowed a small breath to escape. That part he probably understood the moment we left the basement. Emily gave a faint, thoughtful smile at that. "You do not seem surprised by that." I turned slightly to look at her. "Victor and I grew up in the same house. Surprises between us rarely last long." She absorbed that quietly before her attention drifted back toward the road again. For a moment neither of us spoke while the wind moved softly through the branches outside. Then she said something that carried more weight than any of the earlier questions. "When he realizes you chose the rule over him, will he still see you as his brother?" The words hung in the air between us, and the quiet house seemed to listen with us. I thought about Victor standing in the basement with that calm, calculating look in his eyes as the chain fell to the floor. He had not shouted. He had not argued. He had simply watched. "Victor does not see the world in terms of family or strangers," I said slowly. "He sees it in terms of control." Emily nodded once as though she had already guessed that answer, then helping me change that control. "Yes." The clock ticked again behind us while the night remained calm beyond the glass. Emily looked back toward the desk where the flash drive rested beside the laptop, and the realization returned clearly to her expression. "And the files changed it even more." I followed her gaze across the room. The small black device seemed almost invisible from where we stood, yet both of us knew it had already begun shifting the balance between several powerful people who did not yet realize the truth. Emily spoke again after a moment. "If the people connected to those records discover that Victor lost control of the situation, they will not trust him." I nodded slowly. "Which means he will try to correct the mistake quickly." She looked back at me. "And that mistake is me." I shook my head slightly. "No. The mistake was believing the rule could be ignored without consequences." Emily studied my face carefully, as if deciding whether that sentence was meant to reassure her or remind both of us of the reality ahead. Outside, the wind shifted again, and the branches swayed gently across the dark sky. For a moment, the quiet road beyond the trees remained empty and still. Then Emily exhaled softly and turned away from the window, walking back toward the table where the flash drive rested beneath the lamp. She picked it up slowly and looked down at it in her hand before speaking one final time that night. "If this changes the balance of power," she said quietly, "then sooner or later someone will come here looking for it." I walked across the room and stopped beside her while the clock continued its steady rhythm on the wall. The guest house remained calm for now, but both of us understood that calm would not last forever. I looked down at the flash drive in her hand, and then toward the dark window where the road disappeared into the trees. "Yes," I said quietly. "And when they do, they will not be prepared for the fact that the rules still exist."